I've made a list of the 20 most eye-watering, rage-inducing, table flip-warranting, toxic Pokemon cards ever made. These are the type of cards that make you want to take your deck to the nearest game store and bulk it out for pennies. The type of cards that make you want to spoon your eyes out and go touch some grass. The type of cards you just wish were never printed. Rather than rank these cards in order of their toxicity, I'm just going to start from the very beginning and go chronologically from there. Toxicity in the Pokemon TCG started right in base set with energy removal and super energy removal. Attaching energy is a core component of the Pokemon TCG. You can only attach one energy per turn, and you need them to perform your best attacks. Energy removal just removes one of your opponent's energy from play, while super energy removal removes two at the cost of removing one of your own. I imagine the early game designers thinking to themselves, you know what's going to be sweet? We should print all of these awesome Pokemon that people love, give them really expensive attacks, and then make sure that nobody can pay for those attacks by printing energy removal and super energy removal. Oh yeah, and also item finder to get all of those back. That's up to 12 energy removal cards per game. Isn't that just going to be awesome? I'm sure people will love it. As a result of this, the early days of the Pokemon TCG were dominated by attacks that could be powered up with 1 or 2 energy. It wouldn't be a list of toxic cards without mentioning Toxic Gas. Muk from the Fossil expansion has the Pokemon power Toxic Gas, which makes it so that you ignore all Pokemon powers in play except for Toxic Gas. Fan-favorite Pokemon like Blastoise, Alakazam, and Venusaur were already at a huge disadvantage in 1999 since they required setup to get into play. Muk made it so that even if a player did manage to get any of these guys into play, they wouldn't be able to use them anyhow. Neat! Muk further pushed the game towards big basic Pokemon and provided an easy way to stop anyone who planned on bringing a fun Pokemon power to the table. As a kinda concession to the overpowered nature of Muk from Fossil, future renditions of this Pokemon power all had qualifications. Garbodor with its Garbotoxin ability, which was printed in Dragon's Exalted, and Breakpoint requires a tool to be attached in order for it to turn off abilities. Alolan Muk from Sun and Moon base set only turns off basic Pokemon's abilities with its Power of Alchemy ability. There has never been and never will be another ability-locking Pokemon as powerful as Muk from Fossil. Removing energy, removing Pokemon powers, sure, that's all fine. But some of the most devious cards from the early days are the ones that remove the opponent's hand. For those of you that don't know, trainer cards are the basis of any Pokemon deck. It's not uncommon for half of a deck to be made up of trainers. They let you draw cards, search things out of the deck. Basically, trainers let you do stuff. Base set had this card Lass that requires both players to reveal their hands and shuffle all trainers they have there back into their decks. Lass is kinda cool and balanced since both players have to rid their hands of powerful trainers. The Team Rocket expansion said, what the heck, let's just make this whole thing a lot more one-sided. Rocket's Sneak Attack just lets you look at your opponent's hand and shuffle a trainer you find there back into your opponent's deck. This card made it so that the player going first had a huge advantage since they would be able to strip their opponent of good cards before they had a chance to play them. And you know what's better than removing your opponent's trainers? How about removing their entire hand altogether? In the very next set, Gym Heroes, Pokemon released the Rocket's Trap, a trainer that lets you flip a coin, and if heads, you shuffle 3 random cards from your opponent's hand back into their deck. With Imposter Professor Oak, you can limit your opponent to 4 cards, then play Rocket Sneak Attack, hit a trainer, and limit them to 3. Then finally, it's time to finish them off with a Rocket's Trap, and poof, that hand is a goner. Keep in mind, all of these cards were released within the first 2 years of the Pokemon TCG's existence. Looking back, it's kind of a miracle that the Pokémon Trading Card Game survived all of this toxicity. But just wait, this list is only getting started, and things are about to get way worse. Pokémon seemed to know that they messed up a bit with the power level of these early trainers, so they started printing a bunch of cards to block them from being played, the most infamous of which might be Chaos Gym. Released in the Gym Challenge expansion, Chaos Gym is a stadium card that makes it so that everyone has to flip a coin in order to play their trainer cards. And if tails, you'll never believe this, your opponent gets to play your trainer card. You heard that right, pure chaos! With Chaos Gym in play, you have to think twice about playing cards like Super Energy Removal, because if you flip Tails, your opponent is going to get to use that card against you instead. What ended up happening most often with Chaos Gym is that it allowed the player who took an early lead to extend and keep that lead by blocking trainers from being played. Then came Neo Genesis, the first set featuring Pokemon from the Johto region. It looked to be a promising new direction for the Pokemon TCG when it was released in 2000. Thanks to the new baby Pokemon Cleffa, the game was slower, and players didn't need to rely on trainers to draw anymore. And that all would have been fantastic if the set didn't also contain the largest mistranslation blunder in Pokemon TCG history, Slowking. Slowking's Pokemon power, Mind Games, makes it so that every time your opponent tries to play a trainer card, you flip a coin. If heads, that trainer does nothing, and your opponent has to put it on top of their deck. And this power stacks, so you could set up 3 to 4 Slowking and make it so that you could flip multiple coins to stop your opponent from playing trainers or drawing anything new. The way this card was printed in Japan, this Pokemon power is supposed to only work while Slowking is in the active spot, which makes it way worse. Slowking's attack is terrible, and if it had to be in the active spot in order for its power to work, this card would never see play. The craziest thing about all of this is that even though Slowking was mistranslated, it wasn't corrected or issued an errata for years. Players just had to deal with oppressive Slowking decks at major tournaments for years while the mistranslation was not addressed. People often call the original EX era the golden age of the Pokemon TCG, and looking through the cards, I don't think that there were any that I would consider toxic. And you know, maybe that's why people love to revisit this format so much. The pace, the balance, the power level, everything about the cards printed from 2003 to 2007 feels balanced and well considered. That's probably why it's one of my favorite eras to revisit playing. Then, the Diamond and Pearl block delivered one of the most broken cards of all time, Gardevoir from Secret Wonders. Gardevoir warped the entire game around itself, dominating the 2008 National and World Championships in unprecedented fashion. Gardevoir has the attack Psychic Lock, which makes it so that the opponent can't use any Pokemon powers during their next turn. And Gardevoir's Pokemon power, Telepass, allows you to play a supporter out of your opponent's discard pile every turn. With Gardevoir set up, you get to prevent your opponent from using their best Pokemon powers while also playing 2 supporters a turn. And your opponent better not play Judge. Oh, those poor souls. If your opponent played a Judge while you have Guardy set up, that means you are locking them to a 4-card hand every turn with Telepass while also denying them Pokemon powers. Disgusting. Before we get to the next card, I want to take a moment to thank my sponsor, Dragon Shield. Dragon Shield makes the highest quality sleeves and accessories for your favorite tabletop games, like the Pokemon TCG. I've been using Dragon Shield sleeves to protect my Pokemon cards for years. They are the longest lasting and most durable sleeves you can buy, and they come in a variety of styles to fit exactly what you're looking for. My favorite Dragon Shield sleeves are the Pink Diamond, Blood Red, and Non-Glare Black Matte sleeves. These are the ones that I make sure to keep stocked up in my studio to protect my favorite decks. Head over to DragonShield.com today and place an order for some Dragon Shield sleeves to protect your most cherished Pokemon cards. Use code TrickyJim at checkout to receive 5% off your order. Again, that's DragonShield.com for the highest quality sleeves and accessories. And don't forget, use code TrickyJim at checkout for 5% off. In 2011, the game ushered in a new era with the Black and White expansion. Everything got bigger and stronger in Black and White. Basic Pokemon started doing over 100 damage consistently, and trainer cards were more powerful than ever. But what defined the Black and White era was the emergence of Pokemon Capital EX. Pokemon Capital EX were nothing like the original lowercase Pokemon EX from the beloved 2000s. Pokemon Capital EX were all basic Pokemon that basically eliminated evolutions from the game upon release. Just look at the World Championship results from 2012. Only 7 of the top 32 decks at Worlds that year featured an evolving Pokemon, and there wasn't a single evolving Pokemon in the top 12 placements. That, my friends, is the work of one of the most toxic Pokemon cards ever printed, Mewtwo EX. Mewtwo EX redefined the power level of the game when it was released in Next Destinies. You either played 2 to 3 of them in your deck, or you could count on losing to the player that did. Its X-Ball attack does 20 damage times the amount of energy attached to both active Pokemon, which could ramp up to one-hit KO everything in the game with ease. The hilarious thing about Mewtwo is that Mewtwo EX was also the best counter to Mewtwo EX. Since Mewtwo EX is weak to Psychic, you just had to play your own Mewtwo EX to answer your opponent's Mewtwo EX, or you would get run off the board completely. This interaction was known as Mewtwo Wars, and it wasn't uncommon for all of your prizes to get taken or lost by Mewtwo EX. Mewtwo EX changed the power level of the Pokemon TCG in a way that no other card has up until this point in the game's history. Our next card is so blatantly toxic that the word toxic is right there in the name. Hypnotoxic Laser. This card, man! Hypnotoxic Laser made it so that games were constantly being decided by coin flips. It's an item card that says, your opponent's active Pokemon is now poisoned. Then you flip a coin. If heads, they're also asleep. In combination with the Stadium Burbank City Gym, Poison placed 3 damage counters on inflicted Pokemon between turns. The sleep portion of Hypnotoxic Laser is what made this card so degenerate. If a Pokemon stayed asleep in the active while poisoned, that essentially meant that Pokemon was going to get knocked out the following turn without a chance to respond. Even though there's only a 25% chance of keeping your opponent's Pokemon asleep each time you play a laser, that math added up across 4 lasers across countless games, which means that laser flips were constantly deciding the outcome of matches. Hypnotoxic Laser was incredibly powerful upon its release in Plasma Freeze, but it didn't reach its true potential until the XY era with the release of Seismitoad EX. Finally, the perfect partner for Hypnotoxic Laser had arrived. I don't know if there's a more infamous duo in the Pokemon TCG than Hypnotoxic Laser and Seismitoad EX. Seismitoad EX's Quaking Punch does just 30 damage for 1 double colorless energy, but it makes it so that the opponent can't play any items from their hand during their next turn. For context, decks during this time often had about 20 items in them. That's a third of the deck that you just can't play while Seismitoad EX is using Quaking Punch. The one way to play around laser flips was to make sure you had some switching outs in your deck, but with Seismitoad's Quaking Punch, you couldn't play them. That meant that if you stayed asleep while getting hit with Quaking Punch, you were guaranteed to stay there, unable to attack, while your opponent continued to pile up damage. Seismitoad's hefty 180 HP made it a particularly tough Pokemon to deal with under item lock as well. The Black and White and X and Y eras were known for their powerful item cards, and Seismitoad's ability to shut them down will always be remembered as one of the game's nastiest combinations. If you haven't figured it out by now, locking items is kind of a big deal, and Seismitoad wasn't the only card from the X and Y era to do it effectively. Trevenant from X and Y base set has the Forest Curse ability, which makes it so that the opponent can't play items so long as it's in the active spot. With the supporter Wally, which you could play on the first turn of the game going first back then, it was possible to get a turn 1 item lock going first, meaning that the opponent would never have a chance to play any of the items in their deck. At least with Seismitoad EX, it couldn't attack on the first turn while going first, so you always had a turn to set up versus Seismitoad before it could actually attack. Trevenant really started to become problematic once Trevenant Break was released in the Breakpoint expansion. Trevenant Break's Silent Fear attack places 3 damage counters on all of the opponent's Pokemon. So with Trevenant, they would item lock you on the first turn of the game, then proceed to spread damage to all your guys until your board got wiped completely. I played against 3 Trevenant Break decks in the first 4 rounds of the 2016 World Championships and lost to all of them, and no, I'm totally not salty about it. Vileplume from Ancient Origins wasn't the first Vileplume to lock items, but it's certainly the most famous, and that's because Vileplume from Ancient Origins was released at the same time as Forest of Giant Plants. Forest of Giant Plants allows you to break the rules of evolution and evolve a grass Pokemon the same turn it comes into play. That means with some draw power, thanks Shaman EX, you could burn through your deck and establish item lock on the first turn of the game while going first. Originally, this strategy was played with Pokemon EX that were difficult to knock out, like Jolteon EX, Glaceon EX, and Aegislash EX, but the card wouldn't reach its full potential until the release of Decidueye GX in Sun and Moon base set. With Decidueye GX and Vileplume, you could burn through your deck and set up multiple Stage 2 Decidueye GX while also item locking the board with Vileplume on the first turn of the game while going first. With Decidueye's Feather Arrow ability, you could snipe your opponent's threats and finish them off with a big Razor Leaf attack while they sat there, unable to play their items and unable to set up. Cards don't often get banned from standard format in the Pokemon TCG. Like, never actually. It's only happened once. Lysander's Trump card is such a poorly designed supporter card that it only lasted half a year before it was banned indefinitely. It's a supporter card that makes it so that both players shuffle their entire discard pile back into their decks. Yikes. This card wasn't really a problem when it was released in Phantom Forces. Decks just didn't have the draw power to abuse such an effect at the time. But once Shaman EX was released in Roaring Skies, everything changed. Three-time world champion Jason Klaczynski famously won the Madison Regional Championships in 2015, the first Western event with Lysander's Trump card legal, with a Seismitoad EX Shaman EX deck featuring Lysander's Trump card. Defeating what ought to have been a terrible matchup in the finals, he was able to loop his entire deck over and over again on stream in front of the whole world, playing an unending number of disruptive cards like Hypnotoxic Laser and Crushing Hammer while keeping his opponent item locked with Seismitoad EX. Jason then went on to win the 2015 US National Championships that year with his Seismitoad EX Garbodor deck, taking down the equally toxic Wailord EX Wall deck in the finals. The XY era was plagued by broken items and powerful item lock cards. While there were some formats during this time that were enjoyable, many of them were a slog. You wanted to play powerful items in your deck, but anytime you did, you ran the risk of getting locked out of the game by any of the dominant item lock decks in the format. You know, it's funny how quickly the tides of the Pokemon TCG can shift. The early Sun and Moon era was a renaissance in Pokemon TCG card design, with many hailing it as one of the most enjoyable times to play the Pokemon TCG. Pokemon GX added an interesting new element to the game. They had unique attacks that could only be used once a game, and the best ones needed to evolve to come into play, making them balanced. There was one Pokemon released during this time that caused some problems, however. Oranguru from Ultra Prism was a control player's dream card. Its resource management attack allows you to recover 3 cards from your discard pile and put them on the bottom of your deck. With Oranguru, it was possible for players to lock each other out of the game with powerful trainers like Crushing Hammer and Enhanced Hammer. The good times of the Sun and Moon era were never built to last. The release of Tag Team Pokemon raised the power level of the game like nothing had since Mewtwo EX. Tag Team Pokemon, originally released in the Team Up expansion, were the first Pokemon to give up 3 prize cards when they got knocked out. That means you win half the game if you knock out a Tag Team Pokemon. With such a crazy downside, Tag Team Pokemon were stupid strong to make up for it. They had more HP than any Pokemon ever released, stronger attacks than any Pokemon ever released. Oh yeah, and they were all basic Pokemon too. The first truly toxic tag team deck featured Gengar and Mimikyu GX with Trevenant and Dusknoir GX. This deck won the Collinsville Regional Championship in 2020, which was the last major event before organized play shut down due to COVID. Gengar and Mimikyu has the Horror House GX attack, which only costs 1 energy and makes it so that the opponent can't play any cards from their hand during their next turn. And you know what happens when you can't play any cards from your hand in the Pokemon TCG?
Nothing.
Gengar and Mimikyu help to buy a turn while you set up Melodic, and then you'd blow up Melodic and accelerate energy to Trevenant and Dusknoir GX with its Energy Grace ability. Since you knocked out Melodic, you'd be down a prize, and could play Ace Trainer to limit the opponent to a 3-card hand. And with your newly powered up Trevenant and Dusknoir, you could use Night Watch to deal 150 damage and remove 2 cards from the opponent's hand, leaving them with just a single card to fight against your fully established board. This deck was so toxic that Pokemon literally canceled the expanded format when events resumed after COVID. That's right, the last expanded event ever held featured a top cut full of toxic control decks like Trevenant and Dusknoir GX, and one extremely handsome gentleman playing his cool Snorlax VMAX. Of all the tag team Pokemon, however, none were scorned as much as
Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia GX.
ADP, so it was called, sped the pace of the game up in a way that no card had before. Its Altered Creation GX attack makes it so that all of your Pokemon do 30 more damage for the rest of the game. And, whenever you take a knockout, you get to take an extra prize card. So all you had to do to win the game was announce Altered Creation and knock out 2 Pokemon GX or Pokemon V. Then, you win! That's it. Too easy! Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia GX also made it so that single prize attackers were basically pointless, since their biggest asset, being worth a single prize card, was undone. Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia GX dominated the online tournament scene during the pandemic era, and left a lasting negative impression on most of the tag team Pokemon along with it. The Sword and Shield block of the Pokemon TCG was maligned with incessant power creep and, frankly, kinda boring gameplay. My favorite deck to play during this time was Mew VMAX, which, yeah, you know what? Mew VMAX was probably the most toxic deck released during the Sword and Shield block. But I don't care. If Mew VMAX is toxic, then that means I'm toxic too, baby. What made Mew so downright disgusting was its unreasonably strong draw engine featuring Genesect V. Genesect V's Fusion Strike system allows you to fill your hand up to the number of Fusion Strike Pokemon you have in play. With 6 in play, that means you can fill your hand to 6 cards. And with 4 Genesect V in play, well, that means you can fill your hand to 6 4 times every single turn. That's just absolutely ridiculous. Combine that with the fact that Mew VMAX could copy Genesect V's Techno Blast for just 1 energy and boost it to 1-hit KO numbers with Power Tablet, and also lock the opponent out of their abilities with Path to the Peak, and man, that's just a beautifully toxic pile of cards you got right there. No matter how many counters the Pokemon Company tried to print to lessen Mew VMAX's dominance, the card persevered, eventually winning the World Championships in 2023. The Scarlet and Violet block has definitely given me hope for the future of the game. The card design seems generally thoughtful and centered around evolution, which I think is a really good thing. There's a lot of power creep that happened from 2019 to 2023 though, and the Scarlet and Violet cards have to make sense of it, which isn't the easiest thing to do. In my opinion, the most toxic card in the Scarlet and Violet block so far is Dusknoir from Shrouded Fable. Dusknoir's Cursed Blast ability allows you to KO your own Dusknoir to place 13 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. What Dusknoir effectively does is allow a player to dominate an opponent's board by taking multiple knockouts at the same time while controlling the prize trade. By controlling when and where knockouts get taken, you can more effectively employ cards like Iono, Briar, and Countercatcher, allowing you to take a larger command of the board state. Dusknoir feels toxic because it further rewards the player setting up first and unnecessarily speeds up the pace of the game. I know some people out there like this card, but I do think we would have a much more enjoyable and balanced game if it wasn't a part of Standard. And that does it for my 20 most toxic Pokemon TCG cards ever. I know some of you are thinking, but wait, Tricky, why aren't you putting Iron Hands EX on the list? Well, you see, that card goes in my Miraidon deck, and I like Miraidon, so I'm not going to call it toxic. Thank you for understanding. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out in the long run. If you want to catch my live streams here on YouTube, make sure to check out the Tricky Gym Live YouTube channel. And if you want a place to talk all things Pokemon cards, make sure to join the Tricky Gym Discord, discord.gg/TrickyGym. Now y'all take it easy and have a good one. See ya.